lot of books right now on creativity and innovation. And there was a question actually when we started, should we even bother? But from where we sit at Stanford, we've been leading the executive education programs for the last dozen years or so. And we've seen over the last dozen years that innovation as a topic has reached this kind of fever pitch in terms of its level of hype. And yet, despite the emphasis and despite the mentions in annual reports and things like that, yet our observation is that it remains one of the most underdeveloped or undernourished capabilities in any organization. And so for us, the tension of should we write another book, there's already a lot of books out there, was really counterbalanced or overweighted by this feeling that folks aren't treating innovation like a capability. If you think about it, in a lot of organizations, innovation is an event. It's episodic. It's a moment in time. And there's a sprint or a hackathon or a workshop, and that's innovation. That's what a lot of people think of when they think of innovation. And for us, what we believe is it's not an event. It's a practice. And if you aren't practicing regularly, you aren't an innovator. Just like if you aren't doing your scales, you aren't a pianist. If you aren't doing laps in the pool, you aren't a swimmer. And unfortunately, we'd reached an era in this innovation economy where folks do a sprint or a workshop and they go, I'm an innovator, and they update their LinkedIn and they put a badge on, and then they assume that they're all good without any further development of their skills. And what we've really tried to do is shift the narrative from a kind of a done mentality to a begun mentality. No one would ever go to a swim lesson and then say, next step is drop me off in the middle of the ocean, or go to a piano lesson and say, next step is book Carnegie Hall, I'm ready to perform. No, they keep practicing. And yet, for whatever reason, when it comes to innovation, somebody takes a workshop or attends a sprint or something like that, they think the next step is enterprise-wide innovation. And for us, what we felt was lacking was some of the routine behaviors and mindsets that drive a robust and healthy creative practice. And so for us, Idea Flow is meant to address some of these misconceptions and dispel some of the myths around innovation and bring it down to the level of daily practice in the context of business. People who are creative practitioners in other fields like the arts or in entertainment or something like that, they recognize the need for a creative discipline. But for a business person, if you were to ask them, how do you build your creative muscles or how do you build your innovation capacity? Most of the time you get a blank stare. And we felt like that was a fundamental problem that needed to be addressed. And our goal with Idea Flow is that the folks who read it, when they consider this question of how do I practice or how do I stay sharp, they have lots of answers that they can incorporate into their daily life. And it's not that we despise a sprint or look down on a workshop, not at all. We leverage sprints and workshops ourselves. But the point is, when you show up to the sprint, are you warm? Have you stretched? Have you trained? The goal is that when you show up to the sprint, you can really get into the work. And so right now, what we see is people are showing up to the sprint with Cheeto stains on their blazers, right? They've been sitting on the couch. They haven't done any exercise. And that's just not how we approach any other capability. And we felt that it's time for innovation to get approached from a fundamental capability perspective where folks know how to routinely engage the practice so that they can really shine when it matters. There's tons of fascinating research going primarily by Dr. Dean Keith Simonton, who recently won a Lifetime Achievement Award from Mensa. Very simply stated, what Dr. Simonton found is that to get a good idea, you need a lot of ideas. Linus Pauling actually said that. He's the only individual in history to win 2 individual Nobel Prizes. But when Linus Pauling was asked, how do you come up with a good idea, like your breakthroughs that won you the Nobel Prize? His response was, to have a good idea, you need to have a lot of ideas. And our observation is that folks dramatically underestimate the definition of a lot. According to research conducted by our colleague at Stanford, Professor Bob Sutton, it looks something more like 2,000 ideas are required to get a commercially viable idea. When we ask business leaders and organizations, their answer is more like 20. And so folks are not just 1, but 2 orders of magnitude off when it comes to the question of How many ideas do you need to have a good idea? And to us, it's perfectly illustrative of this tendency to think in terms of an event rather than a practice. In an event, my job is to come up with one good idea. In a practice, I'm routinely generating ideas as a part of my life. My favorite example of this is Johnny Ive in the memorial tribute to Steve Jobs after Steve Jobs' passing said, "We ate lunch almost every day." And he said, Steve would often say to me, he said this a lot, "Hey, Johnny, want to hear a dopey idea?" And he said they were really dopey. Some of them were truly terrible. But every once in a while, Steve said something that took the air out of the room, and we just sat there in silence. And to me, the reason that that's so special is when we think about Steve Jobs, we don't think about truly terrible ideas. We don't think about dopey ideas. We think about consumer delight, product category redefining products. And what we've observed is if you want to get to delight, you've got to be willing to have and share dopey ideas. Dopey is the price of delight. And very few people seem to appreciate the significance of that. It's critical to reward failures and to allow for failure at the very least, because the reality is innovation is a risky endeavor. If you're always succeeding, you're almost certainly playing it too safe. Astro Teller, who's the captain of moonshots at Google's moonshot factory called Google X, says the same thing, that failure is the seed of breakthrough innovation. And what he's trying to get teams to do is he's trying to get them to fail more quickly and kill ideas more quickly. And if you don't like that word kill, just think about pivoting. But moving quickly, rapidly through ideas is actually a critical part of early stage innovation. And you've got to be able to pivot. You've got to be able to reorient. And that necessarily looks like failure. But if people are afraid of failure, or if failure is a career limiting move, then you're in trouble. And so if you want to reward innovation, you have to be prepared to reward failure. And if you reframe failure as learning, then that becomes more palatable. The learnings get harvested. The learnings can be repurposed. The learnings can be composted, as we say in our accelerator at Stanford. Failure sucks, but instructs. And the question is your ego so shattered that you can't learn from a failure? Or are your expectations properly set so that you can learn quickly from it? We think about creativity or innovation, we often think about output. However, what innovators know is that creativity is fed by input. And if you aren't seeking new input, there's nothing new for the equation or for the algorithm to be processing. So some simple things that leaders can do to stimulate fresh inputs. Jeff Bezos in the early days of Amazon had 2 days per week that he refused to schedule any meetings just so he could be available for serendipitous discovery. The calendar is one of the greatest weapons a leader can wield to seek unexpected input. Most of the time, the calendar is the reason why someone can't do something. I'll give you an example. We were working with a large tech company with the senior leadership team, and we were helping them think about experimentation in the workplace. And one of their technology leaders is a woman based in Ireland. And when we got to her, we said, "Can you tell us about your experiment?" And she said, "I wasn't able to run an experiment, unfortunately." Mind you, our level of experiments are exceedingly low threshold, 20 minutes, very simple stuff. And I said, "Well, why couldn't you run an experiment? You had 2 weeks." And she said, "Well, it's Wednesday. I'm on meeting number 32 for the week. So when would you run an experiment, Jeremy?" And I realized in that moment, wow, she legitimately doesn't have space to do anything new. So I said, "Okay, granted, you can't do an experiment now. Look at next week. Do you have any time on your calendar?" "No." "Look at the next week. Do you have any time on your calendar?" "I've got half an hour." "Okay, block that half an hour now. And then in the subject line of the calendar invite, I want you to say, 'Take blank action.'" That's it. And then look another week out, would you? And she looked another week out. She had another 30 minutes free. And then I want you to put another calendar invite, review blank action data. And what we realized in that moment is you can actually create space for experimentation, create space for exploration if you think about wielding your calendar differently. And what I would say to leaders is, are you creating space for folks' work to look different? One simple thing that a manager can do is something that legendary professor Bob McKim did at Stanford. When a team comes to you with an idea, do this. Bob McKim would often say, if a student asked him, hey, what do you think of this idea? He would say, show me three. And what he was helping the student realize there is none of the problems that we face have only one right answer. And if you've put effort into one, you should put effort into alternatives, into variation, because the truth is you learn a lot more relatively than you do in sequence.